The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Tombstone, as the auctioneer's voice echoed through the crowd gathered in front of the courthouse. At 38, rancher William "Will" Garrett had come to town to settle a debt, but found himself witnessing something that turned his stomach and challenged everything he believed about human decency. On the auction block sat a young woman, perhaps 20 years old, holding an infant that could not have been more than a few days old. Her dark hair hung in tangles around her pale face, and her simple dress showed clear signs that she had recently given birth. The circumstances that had brought her to this public humiliation were written in her exhausted posture and the way she clutched her baby protectively. "What am I bid for this woman and child?" the auctioneer called out, his voice carrying the casual indifference of someone conducting routine business. "She owes substantial debts to local merchants and has no means of payment. The law requires settlement through indentured service." Will felt his jaw clench as he realized what was happening. In the harsh frontier economy, debtors who could not pay were sometimes forced into temporary servitude, but the practice had largely died out except in the most desperate circumstances. To see a woman who had clearly just given birth subjected to such treatment violated every principle of Christian mercy he had been raised with. "Do I hear $5? The auctioneer continued, scanning the crowd of rough-looking men who had gathered with obvious intent. Will noticed the way some of the bidders were looking at the young woman, and felt his anger rise. These were not men interested in fair labor arrangements. These were men who saw opportunity in a desperate woman's circumstances. $10, called out a voice from the crowd. Will turned to see Jake Morrison, a man with a reputation for mistreating his workers and worse. The thought of this vulnerable woman and her infant child ending up in Morrison's hands made Will's decision for him. $50, Will called out, his voice carrying clearly across the square. The crowd turned to look at him with surprise. $50 was more than most working men made in 2 months, and far more than anyone had expected to bid for an indentured servant. $50, the auctioneer repeated with obvious satisfaction. "Do I hear 60? Morrison looked at Will, with calculation, trying to determine how serious the competition might be. $60, he called out. $100, Will replied without hesitation. A murmur went through the crowd. $100 was a fortune in this place and time, enough to buy good breeding stock or make a down payment on farmland. The other potential bidders began to drift away, recognizing that they could not compete with such an amount. Morrison glared at Will but said nothing more. $100 was beyond what even he was willing to pay for the opportunity to exploit a desperate woman. "Sold to Mr. Garrett for $100, the auctioneer announced with satisfaction. As the crowd began to disperse, Will approached the young woman, who was looking at him with a mixture of relief and apprehension. Up close, he could see the exhaustion in her eyes and the way she trembled with weakness. "Ma'am, my name is William Garrett," he said gently, removing his hat. "I own a ranch about 10 miles outside of town. Can you tell me your name?" "I am Elena Vasquez," she replied softly, her accent revealing her Mexican heritage. "This is my son Miguel. I want to thank you for what you did, but I need you to understand that I may not be able to work very hard for the first few weeks. I am still recovering from childbirth." Will looked at this young woman who was apologizing for her physical limitations while holding a newborn baby, and felt something twist in his chest. "Elena, I did not buy your debt so you could work for me. I bought it so that Jake Morrison could not get his hands on you." Elena stared at him in confusion. "I do not understand, Mr. Garrett." "I understand that you owe money to local merchants," Will continued. "I paid off that debt, which means you are free to go wherever you choose. You do not owe me anything." "But that is impossible," Elena said, tears beginning to flow down her cheeks. "No one does something like that without expecting something in return." Will looked at this woman who had clearly been let down by every person who should have protected her, and understood why his offer seemed too good to be true. "Elena, where is Miguel's father?" he asked gently. "Gone," she replied simply. When he learned about the baby, he decided his business plans did not include a family. He left town owing money to half the merchants here, and they decided I should be responsible for his debts. Will nodded, his anger at the injustice of her situation growing stronger. Elena, I have a proposition for you, but I want you to understand that you are free to refuse. My ranch house is large and I live alone. I could use help with cooking and household management, and you could use a safe place to recover and care for your baby. If you are willing to work for me, I will pay you fair wages and provide room and board for both you and Miguel. Elena looked at him with suspicion born of hard experience. Mr. Garrett, why would you make such an offer to a stranger? Will was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. Elena, 5 years ago my wife died in childbirth along with our son. I have spent every day since then wishing I could have done something to save them. Today I had the chance to help another mother and child and I took it, that is all. Elena felt fresh tears at the pain she heard in his voice. I am sorry for your loss, Mr. Garrett. Thank you, Will replied. Elena, I want you to think about my offer, but first you need medical attention and rest. Dr. Martinez has an office here in town and I would like him to examine both you and Miguel to make sure you are both healthy. I cannot afford a doctor, Elena said quickly. I am not asking you to pay for it, Will replied. I am asking you to let me take care of the bill so I can know that you and your baby are all right. 2 hours later, after Dr. Martinez had confirmed that both Elena and Miguel were healthy, but that Elena needed several weeks of rest and good nutrition to fully recover, Will helped them into his wagon for the journey to his ranch. Mr. Garrett, Elena said as they rode through the desert landscape, I still do not understand why you are helping us. Will looked at this young woman who was holding her baby and trying to process the kindness of a stranger, and felt something he had not experienced since his wife's death, the sense that his life had purpose beyond his own grief. Elena, in the Bible it says that when we take care of the least among us, we are taking care of God himself. Today you and Miguel were the least among us, and I had the opportunity to help. That is all the reason I need. 6 months later, Elena stood in the kitchen of the Garrett Ranch preparing dinner while Miguel played in his cradle nearby, now a healthy, laughing baby. What had begun as a rescue had evolved into something neither she nor Will had expected, a partnership built on mutual respect and gradually deepening affection. Will, she said as he came in from his work, I have been thinking about what you said that day at the auction, about taking care of the least among us. What about it? Will asked, washing his hands before sitting down to the meal she had prepared. I think maybe we have been taking care of each other, Elena replied. You saved Miguel and me from a terrible situation, but we gave you back something you thought you had lost forever. Will looked at Elena and Miguel, who had become his family in every way that mattered, and realized she was right. In rescuing them, he had rescued himself from a grief that had been consuming him. Elena, I think the most beautiful thing about mercy is that it always works both ways. When we reach out to help someone else, we discover that we needed saving too. Sometimes the most important auctions are not about buying property or livestock, but about purchasing the opportunity to demonstrate that human decency still exists. In a world that often seems to have forgotten what compassion looks like,